So my name's Daniel Taseli. I'm Dene. My people are K'asho Got'ine Dene, and we're from Radili Ko, which is called Fort Good Hope on the map. Hello, can you guys hear me? Okay, so Fort Good Hope is an isolated community of about 500 people, and we're about 20 miles south of the Arctic Circle on the east bank of the big river. They call it the Mackenzie River. I've done a few things, and I do some work back home for my people on issues around our rights. But I also do this work for Keepers of the Water, specifically on this tailings campaign that we're working on relating to the tar sands. But I wanted to talk about free, prior, and informed consent. And I was going to start with a story, but given that we're a little behind schedule, I'm going to skip over that. The important thing to point out about Dene, and this is something that I think is common for Indigenous peoples, and it's something that a lot of people talked about yesterday and probably today, but I had to be in and out. And that's the fact that we have places on the land that are significant for various reasons. We have thousands of places that have specific place names and specific stories associated with them. And going to those places to tell those stories and transmit that knowledge to future generations is how we learn our history. It's how we learn about our laws, our spirituality, our culture, and our language. All of that stuff is written on the land. It's not written in books. And the way that is taught, the pedagogy for Dene and other Indigenous people, is to go on the land to these places and tell those stories. And this is not just about place names. It's about other things on the land, like the animals. We got a lot of our knowledge from the animals, and a lot of that knowledge is transmitted by telling those stories about the animals. So this is a fundamental part of our identity and who we are as a people, is being on the land harvesting and being able to go to those spiritual places, those historically significant places, those places that really teach us about our law and our governance and who we are as Dene. And this is important because those things, language, culture, spirituality, those are universal human rights. They're recognized in various UN declarations and international conventions. All people have those rights to language, to culture, to spirituality. And those rights have to be protected and can't be infringed on. The unique situation for Indigenous peoples, though, is how those rights manifest, how those rights exist, and how we practice them and protect them. And that's in relation to land. So that's one thing that sets us apart. One way we're different from non-Indigenous peoples is that those universal human rights that we also have, we need to be able to go on the land to practice that and to protect that and transmit it to future generations. And this has been recognized in international forums that deal with international law. So the Inter-American Court on Human Rights has said the close ties of Indigenous people with the land must be recognized and understood as the fundamental basis of their cultures, their spiritual life, their integrity, and their economic survival. For Indigenous communities, their relationship with the land is not merely a matter of possession and production, but a material and spiritual element which they must fully enjoy to preserve their cultural legacy and transmit it to future generations. And it's because of that that same Inter-American Court on Human Rights said that Indigenous peoples require special measures under international human rights law in order to guarantee their physical and cultural survival. And so the international community and international human rights law has recognized that Indigenous peoples have special rights. And these are often called collective rights. So for non-Indigenous people, these universal human rights, something like religion, that's just me or just you. It's I can go to this church or that church. For an indigenous nation where the spirituality is connected to the land, to sacred places, to something like the caribou that we use to make our drum, which we use to pray, there's not one person who can make decisions about that for everybody. It's a collective right for the whole group, for the whole nation, and everyone has to be involved in that decision making according to your own indigenous systems of governance and law. So those are special collective rights, and they're distinct from other ways that universal human rights are examined and thought of and treated in a non-indigenous context. So I want to talk a little bit, well, I should probably talk a lot about free, prior, informed consent, because that's why we're here. But I also want to talk about the duty to consult, because those are two legal doctrines that are related. There is one key distinction I want to get into, but they are related doctrines, and they both exist under international law. I think a lot of people are probably familiar with this idea of consultation and the duty to consult in Canadian law, but it's something that exists in international law as well. So the idea of the duty to consult is that when a state, like a country's government or subnational governments, are making some decision that could impact the rights of indigenous peoples, they need to go to those indigenous peoples and they need to talk to them. And they need to talk to them in good faith about this proposed decision or action. And they need to talk to them early on in the process of making this decision or taking this action during the planning stage, to actually gather feedback and consider that in good faith from those indigenous peoples. That's the basic idea of this duty to consult. And the former UN Rapporteur on Indigenous Issues, S. James Inea, said that duty to consult is a corollary of a myriad of universally accepted human rights, including the right to cultural integrity, the right to equality, and the right to property. So he's saying that because of the way that universal human rights exist for indigenous people, that's where that duty to consult flows from. So the idea of that duty to consult is to really improve discussions between indigenous peoples and the state, and to ensure that indigenous peoples are included upfront in decision-making processes when their rights are at risk. And the goal of that duty to consult is to obtain the consent of indigenous peoples. So it's often said that that's the goal of this consultation process. But one key aspect of the duty to consult, particularly in Canadian law, is that consent is not necessarily required. So if a state, if a government goes through this whole process of consultation, as long as they gave it the old college try, even if the indigenous peoples withhold consent, they can still proceed with that decision. And I think that's the fundamental distinction I want to highlight between the duty to consult and free, prior, and informed consent, is that idea of consent and it being mandatory in some cases. So free, prior, and informed consent is similar in the process to the duty to consult, but there is that element of consent. And that means that the indigenous peoples whose rights are at risk based on the government action or decision, they can say yes or no. They can give their consent to this proposed action or decision, or they can withhold their consent. That's a key element of this process. In this process of engagement, interaction, discussions with the state, any consent that is given by indigenous peoples has to be free in the sense that there can't be coercion. There can't be duress. The indigenous peoples can't be bullied or pressured or threatened into giving their consent. And I think we need to expand thinking about that to some of the stuff that Ariel talked about yesterday. So if we have communities that have been forced and kept in situations of poverty and dysfunction because of decades and centuries of colonial policies, to the point where any opportunity for jobs is a necessity, it's a matter of survival, then can we really consider any consent that's given in that situation to be free? So ideally, that consent should be free. There should not be duress or coercion or bullying. The consent also needs to be prior in the sense that it has to be given before the decision is actually made. So the idea is not that government can come in after they have planned this whole thing out, it's all laid out, they've applied for the permits, and they're talking to the Indigenous people just to check off a box and say, we talked to them. They're supposed to come in at the front end and undergo the planning process with Indigenous peoples so that the input or decision of the Indigenous nation actually influences the outcome of that planning process or decision. And that consent needs to be informed. So that means that the state, the government needs to give the Indigenous peoples all of their required information for them to understand the decision or activity or project and to figure out what that means for them and their rights and their land, and then take the time to discuss that, deliberate according to their own systems of governance and law, and come to a decision. And that may require that the state provide resources to assist Indigenous peoples in that process. Things like money to hire technical experts or lawyers is often a requirement in these types of decisions. So those are the key elements of free, prior, and informed consent. And this doctrine of free, prior, and informed consent has gained a lot of notoriety over recent years because of its appearance in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that is not the source of this doctrine. This doctrine exists outside of that declaration. But I think it's discussion about that declaration that has really brought this idea of free, prior, and informed consent to the forefront. So one thing I want to highlight is that international law experts who have looked at that declaration say that everywhere this idea of consent, free, prior, informed consent pops up, it's not a mandatory requirement for consent. There are some places where, for example, that declaration says that the state has to seek to obtain the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples. And in those situations, maybe consent isn't a requirement because the state just has to try to get it. They don't actually have to get it. But there are other places in that declaration and other authorities in international law who have said that in certain cases, consent is an absolute requirement before government, before the state can proceed with a decision or action that would impact the rights of Indigenous peoples. And that's really what distinguishes it from the duty to consult in my mind. And I think this is an important conversation to have right now because the state, in our case, Canada, is talking a lot about this UN declaration and implementing it, but has very clearly said that the consent requirements in that declaration is not a veto. So that's how they framed it. They said free, prior, and informed consent is not a veto. And I want to talk a little bit about that later, about that particular usage of language and how they're trying to frame this narrative. But I also first want to push back and say that it absolutely is a veto in some situations. So we have a really clear indication from Canada about what their intentions are in implementing that declaration, and I don't think it's actually going to implement the declaration as intended. So when is consent mandatory? When is consent an absolute requirement for the state, the government to obtain before they can proceed with something? Again, S. James Anea has said that there's two situations in that UN declaration, quote, in which the state is under an obligation to obtain the consent of the Indigenous peoples concerned. And he says that those two situations flow from Articles 10 and Articles 29. And the first one is projects that result in the relocation of a group from its traditional lands. So if a government's going to do something that is going to force people to relocate, they absolutely need their consent first before they can do that. The other case is situations involving the storage or disposal of toxic waste within Indigenous lands. That is also a situation where consent is an absolute requirement. So the government cannot dispose of hazardous waste or store hazardous waste on the lands of Indigenous peoples unless they have obtained their free, prior, and informed consent. But it's not just the UN Declaration. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights has said in general, I shouldn't say in general, it's specific to a case, the Saramacca versus Suriname case. In the case of those people, but I think we can extrapolate their reasoning more broadly to Indigenous and also what they call tribal peoples. But they said in that case that regarding large-scale development or investment projects that would have a major impact within Saramacca territory, the state has a duty not only to consult with the Saramaccas, but also to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent. And the International Law Association's Rights of Indigenous Peoples Committee has added to this conversation, and their opinion is that there's another article in the UN Declaration, 32.2, where consent is an absolute requirement. And that's an article that deals with large-scale projects or activities that would have an impact on Indigenous peoples' lands and territories. And they specifically mention that impacts to water is a large consideration there. And so looking at all of this, what jumps out to me is that I think it's a safe assumption to say that if the government is going to do something that could have a serious impact on your land, and because of that could have a serious impact to your rights, that they have to obtain your consent before they can proceed with that. If government's going to do something that would have relatively minor impacts, then maybe there's no authority in international law or the UN Declaration that says they have to get your consent first. But if they are going to do something that has serious impacts to your land, my conclusion from all of this discussion is that they absolutely require your consent before they can proceed. And if you withhold your consent, they should not be allowed to proceed with that proposed activity or decision that would have serious impacts on your land. And so I want to go back to this idea of how they say that's a veto, because that's how this narrative is being framed in the broader Canadian discourse about these issues. And I think everyone in here is obviously very aware of the issues, so I'm going to ask you to recall the Keystone XL pipeline and what happened around that. I'm not an expert on that, but as I recall, on this side of the border, Canada was all gung-ho and they had it built. It was south of the border that there was Indigenous people, and they were working with non-Indigenous people, ranchers and other people, to stop that pipeline. So that's where all the hubbub was. And ultimately, Barack Obama, when he was president down there, he revoked the presidential permit that had been granted for that pipeline. He stalled it. Then Donald Trump came in, and then Joe Biden, and gave that permit back, and then Joe Biden came in, and I think he canceled it again. If you actually look through all of these newspaper articles that you can find on the internet about those decisions by US presidents to stop that pipeline, there is only one time I have seen that described as a veto. All of the other times that these articles write about it, they say Obama canceled the pipeline, he revoked the presidential permit, Biden killed the pipeline, he stopped the pipeline. So in a situation like that, where it's a settler government that is making a decision to stop a pipeline that Canada wants to build, it is almost never termed as being a veto. And I think that is because the settler Canadian mindset looks at the President of the United States. And it's not just them. Quebec was very outspoken about stopping the Energy East pipeline. And the settler mindset looks at a government like Quebec or a government like the United States federal government, and they recognize, they believe that these governments have a legitimate jurisdiction to make decisions about what happens on that land. And so that is why I don't like that term veto, is because it has connotations of being an arbitrary decision that isn't based on any legitimate jurisdiction. And that's not what it is. When Indigenous peoples are withholding their consent in this process, it is based on their own systems of law, their own systems of governance, and the deliberations and discussions that they have undertaken within their nation to come to a decision. And I want to highlight that there's a lot of people, and we're going to hear from Jean, who is like on the front lines in the belly of the beast around that development, and it's not like that where I'm from, but we are still downstream and we will eventually be affected. And so I want to highlight that it should be all the people who are directly impacted and downstream who are involved in that discussion. And that's one thing we need to keep our eye on when we're dealing with this issue of free, prior, informed consent, is who makes that decision about whose rights are at stake. Who makes that decision? Is it the government or is it the Indigenous peoples? Because if it's the government, they will scope this as narrowly as they possibly can to ensure that the consent requirement only has to be obtained from as few Indigenous nations as possible. And so I just want to throw it out there that myself and Jesse and Jean and Paul went to the Dene National Assembly in Yellowknife, just outside Yellowknife at the Willowday site last summer. And the chiefs at this assembly, this is an organization that does political advocacy work for the Dene people in Denendeh, which is most of what's now land claimed by the Northwest Territories, and then a few nations further south. And the chiefs there passed a resolution opposing this release of treated tar sands tailings and calling on the government of Canada to obtain the free, prior, and informed consent of all downstream Dene before proceeding with that proposal. And so I wanted to throw that out there because I think we should be elevating that messaging moving forward as Canada advances this proposal further and further over the coming few years. So I will hand it over to Jean now to give her presentation and then answer questions. Merci.
Thank you, Daniel. Daniel, my brother. N.W.T, salutine, athneda, denegodo, senia ja hesi tuha. My greetings to all the elders and to the youth and to everyone here, all my relations. Happy to stand here before you to advocate for water, as water is life. I just wanted to reiterate what Daniel said about consent. Consent hasn't been given by me or by any of our women in the Fort McKay First Nation. I speak on behalf of all the women because we are the givers of life, the keepers of the water, and without the women, life cannot go on, and without water, life cannot go on. So, in saying that, I did not give up my consent to the release of the tailings. They call it wastewater. Wastewater is when, after you finish washing your dishes and so forth, that is considered wastewater to me. This wastewater that's contained in these tailing ponds, which they call ponds, are not actually ponds. They're massive lakes that can be seen from outer space. These lakes take up thousands of land that was pristine before they put the water there. Specifically, one of the ponds, they call Pond 1 at Suncor, that was a sacred site that was taken away by Suncor, and it was called Tar Island by our ancestors. This was a special sacred place Suncor took that away from us in the 60s. I was born in the 60s, so I got to see all the impacts as a child from traveling the rivers with my parents. And I also say that I am a residential school survivor, but essentially I survived a genocide, and I'm still standing here today advocating for Mother Earth and for water. I've been given this task passed on by my ancestral roots. My great-great-grandfather was one of the signatories to the Treaty 8 for our area. Our people were relocated from their ancestral grounds and taken away by the government and put into communities. I was taken off my land, off the Athabasca River, at the age of 6. Those stories that I have, experiences that I've went through, still affects me today. I am a mother and a grandmother. Once you become a mother, you have that responsibility for your children to ensure that they live happy, fulfilling lives. And without water, we cannot do that. So therefore, I want to reiterate that I did not give my consent, and I would not ever give my consent for the release of this so-called wastewater that they're identifying as the tailings, which contains toxic chemicals that have been killing our people for the last 50 years. Our treaty rights have far been surpassed by all the raping of our Mother Earth, of all our backyards that surrounds us in Fort McKay. The impacts are physical, emotional, spiritual, mentally. Every aspect of our body has been affected by all the mines around us, and today they are still going full force. They're trying to release this tailings, so-called tailings, to make room for more. Everybody is aware of all the climate change. I come from an area which is the biggest carbon contributors to Mother Earth, and that hurts me spiritually, emotionally, physically. All the releases that go up in the air come down. They come down onto our waters, on our medicinal plants. Everything is affected. Where I live, it's in our face every day. We live in a small community of less than 800. They call us the richest little reserve in Alberta because of all our long-term benefit agreements, which does not benefit me, does not benefit our people in a good way. They throw money at us to keep us quiet. But for many years, I've been quiet as a residential school person. I've experienced a lot of violence. I've even experienced the missing and murdered Indigenous woman. I'm impacted by that as well. My niece is still out there missing for over 10 years now from Edmonton here. My in-law, Jaz Denesulinè, is also missing, a year apart from my niece. Her remains are in a landfill site where they don't want to dig or search for her body. So there's her resting place. All these impacts are genocide against our women. Women are the ones that are life givers, keepers of the waters. I just heard from a friend that TransCanada Energy Pipeline had a spill the other day of 14,000 barrels of oil at Steel City in Nebraska. So there's impacts all across Canada, goes into the United States, and it all stems from my backyard. I speak out for all the future generations because I have the obligation set for me by my great-great-grandfather that signed the treaty. As long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the river flows. Those are real lifetime commitments that have to be honored and respected. Our grandfathers didn't come to the table for nothing. We talk about oral history and how oral history is the backbone of our Indigenous peoples in the North. This is how it's been going on for millennia, since time immemorial. I'm proud to stand here today to represent that, to ensure that life goes on the way we should, as the way we had, as the way we were. I'm a mother to five children, 7 grandchildren. My hope is, after I leave this earth, my words will be embedded within them for them to carry out the work that I have been tasked with. My children are connected to the land. I made sure to do that when they were in their younger ages, just like my parents did for me until I got stolen away to the residential school. At 6 years old, I was made to survive in a brick building with limited food, limited water, a lot of physical torment, mental, emotionally. They stripped me of the physical things, but then they couldn't strip my mind. In my mind, I kept my connections to my ancestors, to my ancestral roots, looking across the lake of Athabasca and knowing where I came from. And that was the water. The water is the one that carried me, my spiritual being, took me away from my physical surrounding in the residential school. It was water that saved me. It was water that connected me to my parents while they were living off Athabasca River. So that is why I speak out to protect that. Because water is our bloodline to our ancestral roots. It is our connection. It is our stronghold. It is our life. Without it, we are nothing. Two in our language is water. But hisna, I live with water. I live because of water. Hole in the hell, even though we drink the water, some of it comes in plastic bottles. Now we buy it from the store. This is wrong, because water should be free. But that's not the case. And now they want to poison our waters further by dumping all these toxins into Athabasca River. Athabasca River flows right by my house. Every morning I get up, I open my door. There's the Athabasca River. That's my strength. That's what keeps me going. It is a shame that the government is dishonoring our treaties, disrespecting our ancestors' words, their so-called promises. These are broken promises to our peoples. Now we have to fight for our water. There's prophecies been told by our ancestors saying that we're going to have a war on water. I'm ready for that war. I will be there to make my voice heard. If I have to be there physically, this is something that is worth fighting for, because it is our life that we're fighting for. There's a lot of things that happened to our community. A lot of our community members have suffered from airborne toxins. I want to share with you one story. When I first started working as an environment coordinator in 2005. I don't have any white papers or anything to back me up for as far as my education. My education comes from my ancestors. I don't have a grade 12 degree or a grade 12 diploma or any kind of sort of degree. I'm not a scientist. Like I said, everything comes from my ancestors. The oral history. I speak from my heart. I speak the truth. And the truth sometimes hurts a lot of people. Our community, a lot of our people depend on the oil sands for their income. I don't blame them, because they have been given no choice. It's a take it or leave it. For myself, I leave it because I depend on the land to feed me, to clothe me, water to keep me healthy, the medicinal plants to keep me strong. More and more, every day we see the effects. Every day we drive into Fort McMurray for groceries. We don't even have a grocery store in our community. We have to travel 45 minutes on the highways that were built for all these companies. The highway leaving the community, you drive past an end-pit lake on one side, and the other side is a tailings pond. Every day you drive by there, seeing all the stacks, seeing all the smoke coming, billowing out of the stacks with all kinds of toxins that are cancer-causing agents. I don't have to name all those. There's too many to name. All I know is it makes us sick, and it's killing our people, even right to the youth. There was a time when elders used to live long lives. That is not so anymore. So when we drive into Fort McMurray, we face all the hustle and bustle of all the workers that are come there to make money. It's a money-making town. That's all it is. Everybody's there for the money. And that is where our treaty was signed. On our return home, again, just before we get home, 10 minutes before we get home, we have to pass 3 tailings ponds. We pass Suncor, and then you feel the stench. You feel the stench, you smell the stench. It affects your throat. Your eyes are burning. Some people call it, oh, that's the smell of money. Well, I don't like that smell. So, passing through another tailings pond just before we get home, on the right side, it takes about close to 10 minutes to get from one end to the other end, driving 100 kilometers an hour. So these are the impacts that we face. We also face the stench in our community. We don't get to enjoy the fresh air. We don't sleep with our windows open at night for fear of the air creeping in at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning when the highest levels of toxins are being released into the air. We have all kinds of air monitoring stations around us, but I don't trust them. Somehow they put the cap way up here, so we're never going to reach that, but yet we feel it. We taste it in our mouth. Our children have to live with this. And now they're calling for more and more expansions of the current oil companies that are there now. The trees are our saviors. They're ripping those away too as well. So what are we going to have to protect our air, to protect our water? They're ripping apart the muskeg. The muskeg is important for carbon capture. Clear cutting happens all around us. We don't have access to a lot of our traditional territory because it's all been mined out. You can only go so far before you run into a gate or something. Then you come to a dead end, and then you turn around, try another route. These are the things we are facing right now, and it's only going to get worse if we don't stand up for our water. I wanted to say our women are going to rise like water. We're going to calm this crisis down. I hear my great-grandfather saying, keep it in the ground. Thank you.